everyone, we have to discuss about that global politics. Part third. Karl Marx. From classical Marxism to new Marxism. The core of the Marxism is and the philosophy of the history, and that the outline and why the capitalism is the dooms, and why the socialism and the eventually communism are the destroyed and to replace it. And this the philosophy is based on the materialistic and concept of the history and the belief, and that economic factor are the ultimately and determines forces in human history. In Marx and views, the history is driven and forward through the dialectical process in which the international contradictions and within each the modes of the productions and reflected and in the class conflict lead to the social revolutions and the constructions of other new and the higher mode of the productions, and which this process was the characterized and by other series of the historical stage and slavery, feudalism and capitalism and so on, and would only in the establishment and of the classless communist and society for Marx and capitalist and development, and nevertheless always had other market and transnational character and leading some to the regards and him is an the hyperglorist and theorist and the desires and for the profits and would derives capitalism and to the streets to tears down and every the barriers and to the intercourses and to the counters the whole earth and for its the markets and Marx and 1973 however the implications and of the of the weaving capitalism and the international system and were not fully explored until the vi Lenin imperialism, the highest stage of the capitalism in 1916-1917, Lenin the portrayed in imperialism is as and the essentially and economically and phenomenon reflecting destroying the capitalism and chaos and to maintain the profit levels and through the exports of the surplus capitals, and this in turn and would brings measures capitalism power into the conflict and which one another's and the resulting wars and World War First and being the essentially and the imperialism and war in the sense that it was found for the control of the colonies and in the Africa, Asia and the elsewhere, and such the thinkings was the further development by later Marxism and who the focus on the uneven development of the global capitalism. Interest in the Marxism was the revived during the 1970 and through the use of the new Marxism theory to explain the pattern of the global poverty and the inequality and dependency theory, and for example highlighted the extent and to which in the post and 1945 and period and traditionals and imperialism and given had giving way to the new colonialism and some the times and views the economic imperialism and or more the specifically and the dollar imperialism and world the systems theories and suggested that the world economic is best national levels and many of the features and that the characteristics and national capitalism that is the structure inequalities and based on the exploitations and other tendency and toward the instabilities and the crisis, and that is rooted and in the economically contradictions the world system and the consist and of the interrelationships and between the core and the periphery and the semi-periphery and core areas such as the developed and north are the distinguished and by the concentrations of capital and high the wages and high the skills and manufacturing and productions. They were for the benefits and from the technological innovations and high and the sustained investment and the peripherous and areas and such as the less developed and south are the exploited and by the core throats, and there is the dependency on the exports of the raw materials and the subsistences wages and the weak framework of state protection and semi peripheral and the semi peripheral areas are the economically and subordinated to the core. Hmm. Subordinated to the core but intense and take advantage of the peripheries and thereby the constitutions are the better between the core and the peripheries and such that thinkings about the inherent and the inequalities and the injustice and of the global capitalism was one of the influences in on the anti-globalization or the anti-capitalism movement and that the emergence from the late 1919 onwards. critically theory Critical theory and often called the Frankfurt and schools and critical theory and to the distinguished it and from the wider category of the criticals and theories or the perspectives and has the developed and into one of the most influential current of the Marxist and inspired and international theory. A major influences on the critical theory has been the idea of the Antonio Gramsci's and the Gramsci's and the argue 1970 argues that the capitalist and class system is the full node the simply by the semi-peripheral areas and are the economically subordinate to core but in turn and take advantage of the peripherals and thereby the constitution is a buffer between the core and the periphery and such the thinking about the inherent and the inequalities and the injustice and of the global capitalism was one of the influences on the anti-globalization or the anti-capitalist movement and there the emergence from the later 1919 onwards. Karl Marx 1818 and 1883 and German philosopher, economists and the political thinkers and usually the poor traded as the fathers of the 20th century communism and after other brief and careers as other university and teachers Marx becomes the increasingly involved in the socialist and movement and finally the settlings and in the London and he the worked and for the rest of his the life as in the active revolutionaries and writer the supported and by his the friends and lifelong and collaborators and Friedrich and Eagles and 1820 and 1895 at the center of the Marx work was other critics and of the capitalism and that the highlights its the transitionary natures and by the drawing attention to the systemic inequalities and the instabilities and marks the subscription to other teleologicals and the theories of the history and that the whole and that the social development and put the in inevitably and the culminates and in the establishment of the communism and his the classics work and was the three volumes capital 1885 to 1887 and 1889 1894 and 1869 and his best now and the most and the accessibles and works and with the eagles and is the communist manifesto 1848 से लेकर 1967 the investment peripheral areas and such as the less and developed and south are the exploited and by the core through their dependency on the exports of the raw materials and subsistences wages and the big frameworks of the state protections. Semi-peripherals and areas are the economically and the subordinated to the cores and but in the terms and take advantage of the peripheries and the thereby the constitution are the button buffer between the core and the peripheries and such the thinkings and about the inherent inequalities and the injustice of the global capitalism and was one of the influences and on the anti-globalizations or the anti-capitalist and movement that the emerged and from the late 1919 onwards. critically theory, and often the called and the Frankfurt's and the school critically theory is the distinguished and it from the wider categories of the critical theory of the perspectives and has the developed into one of the most influences current of the Marxism inspired and international theory. Other major influences on the critical theory and has been the ideas of the Antonio the Gram science in 1970 and argued and that the capitalist class and system is the afford not simply and by inequals and the economic and the politicals powers and but by and what he the turn and the hegemonies and of the values and ideas and the theories and hegemony mean the leadership of the dominations and in the sense of the ideologicals and the hegemonies and it the refers and to the capacities and of the worldviews and ideas to the displays and revise view and the becomes in the effect the common sense of the ages and gram science and ideas and have the influences modern the thinking and about the natures of the world over the global hegemony and instead of the weavings and hegemonies in the conventional and terms as the dominations of one the military powers and over the another's modern new the gram science and has the emphasis the extended to which the hegemonies and the operated and through a mixture of the core science and the consent highlighting the interplay and between economic, politicals, military, and the ideologicals and forces, as well as the interactions and between the state and the international organizations. Robert Cox and thus the analyze and the hegemonics and powers of the USA and not only in the terms of its the military and the ascendancies but also in the terms of its the availability to generate the board and consent for the word and orders and that is the represented and the others and key influences and on the critical theory and has been the thinkings and of the Frankfurt and school a group of the Marxism influences the theory and who worked and as the institution of the social research and which was the established in the Frankfurt in the 1923 relo, relocated and to the USA and in the 1913 and was re-established and in the Frankfurt and in the earth. In the early 1915, the institution was dissolved, and in the 1969, the defining theme of the critical theory is the attempt and to the extended the notions of the critics to all the social practices and by the linking and the substantives and social the researchers to the philosophies and leading the first generation Frankfurts and the thinkers and included the Lord Theodore and Adorno in 1913 1939 36 69 and Marx the Hochmer in 1895 to 1973 and the Harvards and Marcuse and 1989 से निकल के 1979 the leading exponent of the second generations and of the Frankfurt School and was the Gurgan and the Habermas won the 1929 while early the Frankfurt and the thinkers and were the primarily and the concern and with the analysis of the discredited socialities and that theories and such as the Cox and 1981, 1987 and the Andrew Linkaters and 1990 and 1998 and has the applied and critical theory to the study of the international politics in the least three ways and in the first place and critical theory and underlines the linkages and between the knowledge and the politics and emphasizing the extended and to which the theories and the understandings and are the embedded and in other frameworks of the volumes and the interested and this the implies and that as all the theories and is the normatives and those who seek to understand the world and should the adapt and greatest theoreticals and the reflexivity and second critical theories and have the adapt and the actually side and the commitment into the emancipatories and the global politics and they are the concern and to the uncovered and structures oppression, the injustice in global politics, and in orders to advance the causes of the individuals and or the collective freedoms. And third, the criticals and theories have the questions and the conventionals and the associations and within the international theories and within the political community and the states, and is the in so doing openings and up the possibilities of the more inclusively and the maybe and even the cosmopolitans and the notions of the politicals and the identity. Global actors and the anti and the capitalism movement, social movement. There is a general agreement and that the birth of the anti-capitalist movement and also known as the anti-globalization and anti-corporate and anti-the neoliberal global justice and alter the globalization movement and can be the tracked and break back to the so-called and battle of the settles and in the movement in the November 1999 and the when so the 1500 activities and forces the cancellations and of the opening school ceremonies of the World Trade Organization's meeting. This coming out party and for the anti-capitalist movement and provided other modern for the new politics and of the activities and based the theoretical politics and that have the accompanied and most the subsequent lead international summits and the global conferences in some the respected the anti-capitalist and movement and exist on the two levels and one levels is the strongly activities and the oriented and the consist of other loosely and Knits and known the hierarchically and organized and international coalitions and of the usually young and pupils and the social movement and anti the calculating the concern of the environmental groups and trade the union religions groups and student groups and anarchist revolutionaries socialism and the campaigns for the right of the indigenous peoples and so on and on the others levels and the anti-capitalism movement is the experts and orientated and focus on the number of the leading authors and they the work and the involving through their the influences in much the wide range of the pupils, many of whom are not the directly involved in the activities and but the sympathetics and generally and with the movement goal leading figures and but by no the means and leaders include the Neoms and the Chomsky and Nomi claim and the Norina and Hudge 2002 significant. It is the very and the difficult to make the judgment and about the impact of the social movement and because of their typically and board and sometimes and the nebulous and culturals and goals. It would be the absurd and for the example to the right of the anti-capitalist and movement and as other failures and simply and because of the survivals and worldwide of the capitalist and systems proponented and of the anti-capitalist and movement and argues that it is the nearest thinking to other counter to a counter hegemonies and forces in the modern global politics and it is the role and beings to expose and the content and the disclosed and the practices of the neoliberals and the globalization. It is rightfully and described and as other movement of movement in that the inequalities and the asymmetric generated and by the corporated globalization are multiplaces the anti-capitalist movement therefore provided a vehicles and through and which the disparate and ranges of the pupils and or the groups and which have been the marginalized or the disenfranchised and as a result of the globalizations and can gain other politicals and voice and in that the sense and the movement is other democratics and forces and the uprisings and of the oppressed and the seemingly and the powerless the anti-globalizations movement and can be the credited and with the having alterated and the thinking on a the wide ranges of the transnationals and issues and even and with the having and the received and global political agendas and this can be the seen in other heightened and awareness of for the example environmental issues and especially global warmings the failings and of the market and based the development and poverty reduction strategies and so forth, and UN the conferences and the bodies and such as the WTOs, the World Bank and the IMF, and now the operates within other political and the intellectual climates, and that is the different. And from the 1918 and 1919 and the anti-capitalist movement has the contributed significantly and to this and the criticism and of the anti-capitalist movement, and have the sometimes and been the damnings, and however and most the seriously it has been the condemned and for its the failures, and to the developed the systematics and the coherent and the critics of the new liberals and the globalizations of the failures of the futures, and to the outlines a the viable alternative, and this the reflected in both the highly and the diverse and natures of the anti and the capitalism and the movement, and the fact and that it is the goals and are not the commonly and incompatibles, and while the minority of its the supporters and are the geniusly and anti the capitalism adopting other Marxism styles and analysis of the capitalism, and that the highlights it's the inherent inflow and most of the groups and the supporters, and wish the merely and to the remove the wars and axis of the anti-capitalism, and the similarly the anti-capitalism and movement is the divided over globalization itself, and while the some such as the nationalism and cultures and activities and the compositions and for the right of the indigenous peoples and object to the globalization in the principles are large corporations and of the movement and support, and which only to break the link and between the globalizations and the neoliberals attempting and to the establish a form of the alternative globalization, all the alters and globalizations and other serious decisions, and within the anti-capitalist movement is between those and who the link global justice to strengthen the regulations and at other national global level, and anarchist and the elements and who the distrust government and the governance in all its the forms. एंटोनियो ग्राम्सी एंड द 1891 से लेकर के 1933 इटालियन मार्क्सिस्ट एंड द सोशल थ्योरिस्ट एंड द सन ऑफ द माइनर पब्लिक ऑफिशियल्स, एंड ग्राम्सी joins the socialist party in 1939 but the switch to the newly the formed and Italian communist and party in the 1921 and being the recognized and as its the leaders, and by the 1924 he was the imprisoned by the Mussolini in the 1926 and the remains in carcerated and units his the birth and in the prisons notebooks 1970 and written between the 1929 से लेकर के 1935 and Gramscio shoots to the redress the emphasis and within the orthodox and the Marxism on the economics or the material factors and the rejecting any the forms of the scientific and the determinism. He the strengths and through the theories of the hegemonies the important and of the politicals and the intellectual struggle, and Gramsci instituted and that the argues and hegemonies and could only be the challenges and aid the politicals and the intellectuals level and through other counter hegemonies and struggle carries out in the interested of the proletariat and on the basis of the socialism principle and value and the theory. Social influence, social constructions. Social contradictions. Social contradictions and the social contradictions and has been the most influences and the post positives and approach to the international theory and gaining the significant. theories through structure or the agencies is the global politics and best explained in the terms of the structures, the context and within the which and the actions takes place on in the terms of the agencies, the availability of the human actors and to influences influences event a the variety of the approaches and to the global politics and have other structurism and the characters that is they and adapt and what can be and called in the outside and in the approach to understandings the nature of the thus contact and the varies and the howevers neuralist and the sometimes and called the structures and realist explain the behavior of the state in the terms of the structurals and of the international systems while the Marxist and the emphasis and the crucial impact of the international capitalism and sometimes seen as the world and the systems and by the new and the Marxism and theorists and even the liberals and recognize and the limitations imposed on the individuals and the state and by the complex and web of the economic interdependencies into and which they have been enrolled the particularly by the forces of the globalizations and one of the attraction of the structuralism is that and by explaining the human and the behavior in terms of the external or the exogenous and factors and it is the dispensation with the vagaries and of the human volition and the decisions making allowing the theories of the claims and scientifics and the precisions and it is the disadvantage through the is that and it is the lead to the determinism and which rules and out free and build the all together. Alternative theories and they whether acting as the individuals or as the social group and the constructions and the world in which and they live and the act according to those the constructions people believe and the assumptions and become the particularly significant and when they are the widely and shared especially and when they the servant to give a the communities or people's other sense of the identity and the distinctive and interested in as such as the contrast and the analysis highlight the missing dimensions and to the structurals and against the debates and in the global politics and constructivism and the standard in other sense between the inside out and the outside in the approach in that and it is the whole and that the interactions between against and agent and structures and are always the meditated by the identity identitionals and factors and belief the values and theories and the assumptions and thus the ideas nulls and factors and affect and both how and agents and see themselves and how they the understand and response to the structures and within which they the operated the however and this the implies and that the social constructivism is not and so much either substantives and theories or set of the substantive theories as in the analytical tools and the approach to understanding and one of the most influences the formulations of the social constructivism and was the Alexander's and Watts asserted that the anarchy and is what and the student make of it. This implies and that the state behavior is not the determined and as the neuralist and assert by the structures of the international system, but by how the particular state and view the anarchies and while the some states and may view anarchy and is the dangerous and the threatening other may see it as the basis. See it as the basis. seen in the relation and to the national and the nationalism. National nations and are not the objectives and the entire and group of the peoples who happen to share other common culturals and heritage. Rather they are the objectives and entire. This stance and may have the optimistics and or the pessimistics and the implications and on the one hand and it is the leaps and open the possibilities and that the states and may the transcendence and a narrow perception of the self-interested and embrace the causes of the global justice and even the communitarian. On the other hand, it is the highlight the possibilities and that the state and the others and international actors and may fail and pray to the examples and exemplars as and aggressive positive politicals and greed. However, ethics of the constructivism has argued extend to the basically are the shaped and by the social and the economical and the political realities and at the end of the day and ideas and do not fail from the sky and like the rain. They are the product of the complex social realities and either reflected and the ongoing relationship between the ideas and the material world. Post-structuralism and the emerges alongside the post-modernism and the two and terms and sometimes and beings the used and the interchangeably and the post-structuralism and emphasis and that all the ideas and concepts are the expressed in the language in which itself is the imaged and in the complex relations of power and influence the particularly and by the wirings of the Michaels and fourfold. Post-structuralism and has drawn an attention to the link and between the power and the system of the through and using the idea of the discourses or the discourses of the powers and in the crude terms and this the implies and that the knowledge is powers and however and in the absence of the universals and frame of the reference or the overreaching representatives. However, in the absence of the universals and the frames of the conference or the overarching in the perspective and there the existence only as a series of the competition perspectives and each of the which and represented the particulars and the discourses and of the powers and such the view and has sometimes and been associated with the Giscues and the dairies and 1967 and 1976 and famous the formulations and there is the nothing outside the text and post-structurals and or the more post-modern thinking has extended and growing the influences on the international relation theory and expectalism and since the publications of the Dar and Darians and the Suporos and internationals and nationals in 1989 post structural to the fact that any the political event and will always be the subsidials and to the competing and entrepreneurs and 9 upon 11 is other example of his and not only is the theirs for the post structuralism and Duckside and Davidson about the weather and 9.11 is based the conventions. Alexander Belt and it born 1985 से Alexander Belt, German-born international relation and theory and who has the worked and mainly in the USA, and Welt is the meta and socialist and who has the used and the contradictism and the analysis to provide other critiques of the both and neoliberalism and the neoliberalism, and he the accepted and that the state and are the primarily unit of the analysis and for the international political theories, and but the argues and that the state and there the interested and should not be the taken for the granted, and they key the structures of the state systems and are the inter and the subjective rather than the materials, and in that the states and act knowing and are the equally and valid and the fair and thus the and Fleshwood, and however since the 1918 positivist and approach into the international politicals and has been the subject to the criticism and from other range of the so-called and post the positivism approach, and thus the included critical theory and the constructivism and the post and the structuralism, and in the clear respected and feminism, and what does the approach knowing are equally and valid and thus the rejected and the ideas, and that even the science and has the distinguished between the truth and the falsehood. However, since the 1918 positivism approach into the international policy polities and has been the subject to the criticism and from other ranges, and so thus include the critical theory and the constructivism and the post-structuralism, and in the certain and the respected feminism, and what does the approach and have in the common is that and they the questions and the belief and that there is and the example reason rather the संजय जो मोबाइल उते ले जाइए।